Seems like everybody is launching a podcast, and I am no exception. And so in today's episode, I'm going to be sharing the audio and video setup for Out of Frame, my new video podcast. What's up, friends? The Nerdy Filmmaker here. Like I said, launching a new podcast called Out of Frame, interviews with content creators and actors, and I'm really excited to share it with you, but I'm also really excited about the equipment. I've always been really into tech and equipment, and so it was really exciting to learn about a whole new genre of equipment. I'm gonna start with the audio because for a podcast, audio is definitely the most important component. And to start, I've got this lovely thing right here. This is the Rode Pod Mic. Now these are quite inexpensive for the quality of microphone. I was looking at this and kind of the leading microphone, the SM7B, I think it's called, but $130, I think, a microphone is really hard to beat. I was only going to be getting two, and eventually, if this podcast takes off, then I'll probably be investing in those fancier microphones, but for now, these are totally fine. These are dynamic microphones, meaning that they're meant to be extremely close to your mouth. And why is that so important? Well, I'm filming in a big room, and that room has a lot of reverb. And so dynamic mics are extremely helpful in reducing the amount of reverb in the audio. I don't have any pop filters for these yet, but that'll be the next step. Really happy with these microphones. Could absolutely recommend it if you're gonna be looking for a cheap start to your podcast. I believe actually they just announced a new version of the microphone that also uses USB, because these microphones are only XLR connectable, which means you're gonna need an actual mixer, which I do have and we'll get to in a second. But if you wanna record directly into a computer, maybe the new version of the pod mic that has a USB connection would be great for you. Now, this microphone is attached to a handy dandy boom arm. This is the Rode PSA-1 Plus. All right, now I opted for the Plus instead of just the regular PSA-1 because apparently it just has less sound when you move the microphone around. It doesn't like creak as much. It really, I could have gone with the other one. It really doesn't make that much of a difference. I just like to spend more money if I can. I'm really happy with these. It has a desk clamp or something that you can drill directly into a desk. I wasn't going to do that because this was a temporary setup in my studio at Beanduck Productions, but it's extremely fluid, really stable, can hold the pod mics, which are a bit heavier than other microphones. It even has little cable run clips that run along the top so you can run your XLR through and around the top. Just kind of cleans things up a bit. Next up, my microphone and my guest's microphone attached to the Rodecaster Pro 2. One of the big upgrades between the 1 and the 2 was that they had these new fancy preamps that make all these microphones sound really crisp and have the appropriate amount of power. The Rodecaster Pro 2 comes with 8 pads for sound, and you can cycle through them so you can store something like 64 sounds or something like that in there. Probably not something I would ever use in a recorded podcast, but might be really helpful if I was doing a live stream, because the thing can be used as a live stream as well just by connecting to your computer. You can just queue it up there. You can queue up your intro music, all that kind of stuff. The version I have has 4 XLR inputs and 4 headphone out 1/4-inch plugs, and it records onto a micro SD card. It also lets you record pre or post faders. What that means is that as you're using the faders on the board, you can either just bypass that level and come out with kind of like with that raw audio, or you can be mixing on the fly. And because this whole video podcast setup is really just me, I don't have anyone helping out with the tech of it. I just set it up and hope it works. Then I'm not using the faders. I'm doing pre-fader recording directly into my computer so that I can see it's recording. I'm looking at it literally right now as I'm recording this, and I can see the waveform recording, so I know everything is good. There are lots of fancy buttons and stuff to play with on this mixer. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but if you would like, let me know in the comments and I could do a more in-depth review of the Rodecaster Pro 2. So those are the main components of the audio, and that's what's letting me get all the reverb out of the space. There's a lot of reverb in that space, so those things all together, being able to use the boom arm to get it as close as they want it. Let's say they're leaning back and they want to pull it in. Really the only thing I need now is the pop filters, which kind of gets rid of those plosives. But because in the interviews I'm monitoring the sound with headphones, at least I can tell if someone's talking too much into the microphone and I can readjust it for them. Next up is the actual video component. So this podcast is a video podcast. It's going to be existing on YouTube as well as on Spotify and Apple and all those things. I, of course, wanted to make it a video podcast because I like to make as much work for myself as possible. Editing has taken a very long time, but let me share with you what the actual video components and setup of the podcast setup is. Right now, I'm shooting this on my A7S III. It's the Sony camera. That is the camera that I'm using to point to my guests. The reason I'm using that camera on my guests is because, to me, the guests is more important. This is definitely, at least, I want to say the better camera, but has a significantly better autofocus. So I really want to make sure that the guests' footage is always in focus. So I'm using the A7S III with an 85mm lens on them, in order to really blur out that background and isolate the background. Meanwhile, I'm shooting my angle on a much older camera, the Sony FS7. That's much more of like a cinema camera, but the lens I have for that is not autofocus. So you really I have to like have my guests sit there and then focus on them and hope I'm nailing it. Spoiler, one time I don't, but again, at least the guest is in focus, and to me that is so much more important. Again, on that camera, I am also using an 85mm lens. I would love to get a second Sony camera that's like around this generation, just so that the autofocus and the colors match a little bit more. Finally, I'm lighting the entire interview with only a single light. The light itself is a Godox VL150, and it's an LED cob light. There are definitely significantly cheaper versions of that light available now, and I can leave a link in the description along with all of this equipment if you want to see maybe an alternative that's a little bit cheaper that has come out since. And on that light, I actually started with a softbox. It was a softbox that had a grid for the first few interviews, but I'm gonna admit, I got a little bit lazy and didn't want to keep setting that behemoth up. So I ended up switching to an umbrella, which did a fantastic job as well. It was just a regular shoot-through umbrella that really spread the light nicely, and especially because the table that we're shooting at is dark, it's black, it means that there's not a lot of reflections coming up. So I wanted to make sure that the light that was up there was being softened and spread out really nicely. I would love to get a space that I don't have to set up and tear down every time I run an interview. The whole setup and takedown together takes about an hour to an hour and a half if I'm doing it alone. And so to not have to do that every time would be a dream. And to have kind of like sound panels around the side would be really, really great too. Now, you definitely don't need this level of equipment to run your own podcast. The audio aspect of it is definitely significantly cheaper than what I have in terms of video, but that's because I'm a director, like I'm a filmmaker, so I already have that equipment. To give you an idea, all of the audio gear for the podcast altogether cost about 2,000 Canadian. There are ways you can cut that down. You don't have to get the kind of updated boom arm here. That might save you 50 to 100 bucks. You can get maybe the Rodecaster Pro 1, or they, again, just announced other versions of the Rodecaster Pro 2 that are smaller, more compact. And so, again, that might save you some money if you never plan on having 4 guests at once. There's one that's coming out that only has 2 XLR inputs. Finally, if you want to just record directly into your computer, you can get microphones that are USB connectable and cut out that whole interface altogether. But because I have other ideas of how I can monetize this equipment, I just wanted to invest in it right away because I like spending my money. So that's my podcast equipment. If you'd like to know a little bit more about any of those pieces, or maybe a video on my editing process for a podcast interview, let me know. The episodes of Out of Frame will be coming out soon, or maybe they're already out by the time you're watching this video. In which case, I really hope you enjoy the show, and let me know in the comments if you don't. Don't do that. I don't want to know. Don't tell me if you don't like it. Only positive. All right, I'm gonna go eat some soup because I don't know if you can tell or not. This guy's sick. All right, bye. Out of frame. Whoops, out of frame. Frame. I'm drunk.